the 18th of July, and something terrible has begun in Crimea. A new wave of explosions on the peninsula, Tarkankut, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol, explosions.
Now, out of 12 missiles that were heading toward the bridges, you can see right now this is the Chonhar bridge.
The security service of Ukraine is now officially launching a significant new phase of its special operations, specifically targeting the strategically vital Crimean bridge, various critical military facilities, key airfields, and numerous military bases. Consequently, a widespread and palpable sense of panic has already started to spread throughout Crimea. And
evacuation, we've been standing here patiently since 4 a.m. this morning, waiting for what feels like an eternity for a mere 25 minutes. In reality, it has been approximately 5 long hours. Here, for the 6th consecutive time, they have inexplicably turned us around and sent everyone back home to rest and recuperate. We will thoroughly discuss all of these pressing matters and more with the well-known and highly respected military analyst, Roman Svitan.
Right now. A new series of explosions in Crimea. My God, the security service of Ukraine can't be stopped. Tarkankut, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions. Panic has started in Crimea. Evacuation in Crimea. The security service of Ukraine has begun the second phase of the special operation. The Kerch Bridge and Russia's nuclear triad. Ukraine is attacking two parts of Russia's nuclear triad, the headquarters of the Northern Fleet, the nuclear submarines, Severomorsk, strategic nuclear bombers, and the Kerch Bridge.
The bridge is damaged, meaning at least one of its supports has been damaged. If we look at the overall attack on Russian strategic targets, specifically strategic ones, for example, strikes on aircraft of Russian strategic aviation, these are strategic targets, especially since there are 5 of them. As it turned out, 5, just as we said. The thing is, they didn't count the one in Ukrainka, but at least one has been hit there, already confirmed at 95% in Ukrainka. So strategic aviation. After that, the strategic bridge, a real bridge, which has strategic importance because it connects Taman. It connects Russian territory with our peninsula, Crimea. And if it is put out of commission, destroyed basically until we liberate Crimea, or for example, until a bomber can approach and simply drop hundreds of aerial bombs on it, this bridge, it can't be destroyed. There are certain factors that make it impossible to do so. The only options are engineering methods for its destruction, meaning blowing up all the pillars. So you'd have to bring it down, but there would be a lot of problems with that at the very least. Deactivating it from an active state. For example, just damaging it at the moment as it was once damaged by the security service. And in 2022 and 2023, it was put out of commission there for a certain period of time. At least for half a year, for example, during the summer campaign, this would really be a significant blow. Specifically, the Kerch Bridge is tied to the beginning of our liberation campaign for the deoccupation of the Crimean Peninsula. Why? Because clearly the bridge must first be destroyed or damaged or put out of commission. There are different ways to do this. It needs to be disabled so that the Russians can't transfer enough forces to Crimea. After that, with long-range strike capabilities using the same drones, missiles up to Crimea, that's 200 to 300 kilometers. We have the capability. Almost everything we have can fly that far. That is the main range for our long-range strike systems at the operational level, which are also handled by the security service. Therefore, I think the next wave will be strikes specifically on military targets in Crimea, of which there are more than 100. At a minimum, there are currently over 100 stationary sites in operation and about 100 mobile ones. The work of the special services lies ahead. There is an enormous amount of so-called work to be done. But this much can already be said. The strike on the Kerch Bridge is the beginning of this liberation campaign.
Roman Igorovich, regarding the nuclear triad, I heard a comment from Kit Kellogg is simply stunned. He believes this is an enormous, colossal problem for Russia. This is what is called escalation, that Ukraine struck at 2 components of the Russian Federation's nuclear triad. This concerns the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation, where the nuclear submarines are located, and of course the strategic nuclear aviation. How much of a breakthrough is this? And do you feel that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the second phase of the SBU special operation?
That means there will be a third. If, for example, they hit a Russian submarine, I wouldn't be surprised, on the same Northern Fleet, on the same Pacific Fleet, because they feel far too comfortable in the seas. We have already struck both the Russians' land positions and their strategic positions. Only one component remains, the so-called naval component. So in the near future, most likely, if you haven't noticed, the main intelligence directorate has gone quiet. They carried out operations in Vladivostok against the Russian Pacific Fleet, and then went silent somewhere, not ruling out the possibility that yet another Russian submarine might sink. Putin, as always, will say, what happened to the Kursk, to the submarine? It sank. What happened to the Astrakhan aviation? It burned down. What happened with the Pacific Fleet there? Well, it broke up into quarks. So that could happen too. Let's wait and see. There's probably still a third serious blow ahead. And this is the first one you're right to point out regarding the triad. Focus your attention properly. Why? Because the air component is one of the main components, and it was the first to be put into service. Specifically, strategic bombers, that's the strategic. Russia's nuclear arsenal. Malyuk strike showed that this component no longer dominates the world, definitely. Why? Because of a $500 one, some kind of drone or sufficient number of drones can practically destroy Russia's strategic aviation. It's possible. Everyone understands perfectly well that now is already the era of drones. The era of drones, it feels like in the near future, planet Earth will turn into something like that. The planet of Shlesiaka, no water, no vegetation, no minerals, inhabited by robots. In other words, it's inhabited by these kinds of drones. And in the end, this potential apocalypse could very well come true, the one that was once vividly shown in many classic Hollywood movies. So this significant and pressing problem truly exists in all the various countries of the world that have wisely invested in robust strategic security mechanisms and comprehensive defense systems. I mean, what was the point of investing tens of trillions of dollars over 100 years into something that in the end a $500 drone can just take out in a matter of seconds, as Malyuk demonstrated? So I would put it this way. Malyuk and the security service of Ukraine have become central at the start of a new era in security provision. Other mechanisms, the real investment should be in robots. By robots, I mean, of course, those advanced drones that are capable of accomplishing significant and complex major tasks with minimal financial funding. However, it is important to consider that all these intricate strategies in the end will inevitably be destroyed. Once, if anyone remembers, Raikin, I think it was him, may he rest in peace, once said, he had a great monologue. It was about those 6-story fools, the dinosaurs, where are they now? Extinct. But the bedbug, it's been around for 3 billion or was it 30 billion years, and it's still alive and well. That's more or less how it is now. The next era will be something along those lines. In other words, the bedbugs we're talking about now, these very small, highly advanced drones that continue to keep getting even smaller and smaller in their physical size, but without ever losing their crucial combat effectiveness or their operational capabilities. And eventually, what will they reach? To what Putin recently anticipated, together with Skabeva and the whole Russian media riffraff, they laughed about Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. Everyone was joking about combat mosquitoes. But believe me, when billions of these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes enter Russian Siberia or beyond the Urals, up to the Urals, I won't even say anything. There won't be a single Russian left there. They'll be drawn by the scent. And the Russian spirit smells so strong, oh boy, no filter can help with that. You have to wear gas masks if you're anywhere near where Russia or the Russian Federation is. So naturally, following the scent, these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes will wipe out the entire Russian herd. All this Russian federalist herd that attacked Ukraine.
Roman Egorowicz, regarding the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet of Russia, is it even possible to carry out a special operation there?
It's definitely possible. As for the Northern Fleet, on the one hand, it's simply closer because it's just over 1,000 kilometers away, and basically we've already carried out missions there. And Lenin is not far from the base. So in principle, this direction is possible even with long-range strike systems launched from our territory. And as for Vladivostok, in some ways that's even easier. We've actually talked about this ourselves. What is Vladivostok, really? Well, it's the Green Wedge, the far eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, which is populated not by robots, but by Ukrainians. Ukrainians have been there genetically for over 100 years. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians were brought there under certain programs, mostly from the Poltava and Chernihiv regions. Why is there an airfield called Chernigovka there? Well, I know this from the airfields, for example, Chernigovka, and the same with Ukrainka. Well, those are our people from Poltava and residents of the Chernihiv region back in the day. Naturally, genetic roots make themselves known. And Vladivostok is actually one of the main jewels of this green wedge of ours, the Ukrainian one. Vladivostok, of course, getting there is a bit of a challenge, all the more so because if we ultimately recognize the government's knowledge of the far eastern Ukrainian people's history, then it could even, for example, make agreements with Japan about returning those same disputed islands, like supposedly those are Japanese islands. And even Sakhalin is a Japanese island. So this issue really needs to be addressed there, and at the same time, of course, by putting pressure on the Pacific Fleet, because there are Ukrainians in the fleet as well. Do you really think our warrant officers aren't there? Yes, practically every other one for sure. Ukrainian, our good old genetic tree when it comes to warrant officers, because back in the day in the Soviet army, all the warrant officers were Ukrainians and all the warrant officers in the Navy were Ukrainians. So believe me, if the survival of our nation is at stake, this so-called ancestral gold will make it possible to sink almost the entire Pacific Fleet. And if done right, if we approach our relations with the Japanese and South Koreans correctly, they'll even help us because it's in their interest too.
Roman Lenin, when you spoke with military analysts, they said that the Topol and Yars are part of the powerful nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. How important are these assets? For example, is the destruction of a Topol or Yars a realistic target for Ukrainian special services as well, naturally?
Well, that's rather difficult, of course. The thing is, these are, after all, troops. Strategic troops, missile forces. So there's certain selection process for service there, and there are some aspects related to polygraph testing. So there's very strict control over this particular component, and it would be very difficult to get close enough to destroy these missiles. The Russians themselves, knowing that they're a bit clumsy, might end up ruining them on their own. The Topol is an excellent missile. It was first launched, I believe, back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. Later, the Russians refined it to a more or less acceptable state. But the main foundational, so to speak, baseline starting conditions were, of course, still from the Soviet Union. They had a strong tradition there, a real rocket engineering school, especially after our Ukrainian basically bet everything on the rocket program, if I remember correctly. That is, as General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Khrushchev accomplished this task and Brezhnev refined it further. Again, both of them were Ukrainian. That's why the rocket program, of course, was so well developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians picked up on certain aspects, but because the Soviet Union collapsed and the components of the overall production cycle, they ended up scattered across different republics. By the way, the main ones were here with us, right here in Ukraine, because we had the SS-18, also known as Satan. We built it at Yuzmash. Naturally, the Topol is a successor of this kind of missile program, especially the Topol-M. It's a decent missile. The next one after it is also there. Well, it's not exactly a clone, but it's pretty much the same missile, just with a different warhead, one with multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. That's already the Yars, then the Yars RS-24, then the RS-26. They built those. They tried to build the Oreshnik, the so-called Rubesh. That's the Rubesh, Putin called it Oreshnik. And the next line, the fourth missile there, is the RS-26. The A-28 is already the Sarmat. But The Sarmat can't even get off the launch silo anymore. Out of 7 launches, there were 6 explosions, and several silos were completely destroyed. And most likely, this whole series of missiles has been written off. In other words, they won't really have the Sarmat. They'll keep fussing over the Oreshnik like a fool with a rattle. But once its media hype dies down, at least they'll probably forget about it too. But there are 2 missiles that are serious and problematic for us and for the whole war. Those are the Topol and the Yars. They can travel more than 10,000 kilometers. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both the Topol and the Yars have nuclear warheads, and the Yars has multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, about 6 warheads, each with its own guidance. So this is indeed a serious problem, although perhaps it's not as much of a problem for us. Since these are nuclear weapons, the Russians aren't going to use them against us. And to fire a conventional intercontinental ballistic missile at yourself is like using a microscope to hammer in a nail, because this isn't a problem for us. It's a problem for NATO generals, for the Chinese as well. In other words, these are long-range means of destruction. Our main problem is different. It's the Iskanders, the KN-23S, and the Kinjal missiles. In other words, these are aeroballistic missiles that need to be neutralized. The optimal way to neutralize the use of these missiles is, of course, to destroy Russia's hydrocarbon industry, because everything depends on it in some way, whether it's the shell casing or the gasoline. It all runs on aviation kerosene. The hydrocarbon sector needs to be destroyed. Bankova has ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon sector. That's why this problem exists here, because it's very difficult to defend against a ballistic missile. We should have had our own a long time ago. It's already the 7th year. We probably could have put these missiles into serious production by now, but we still haven't seen them yet. Well, we hope that eventually we'll get them, our own ballistic missiles. But the problematic issue for us, of course, is the Russian Iskanders. So first, we need to destroy their hydrocarbon infrastructural, Russian oil refineries, everything related to production. And second, of course, is air defense, that is increasing the number of anti-ballistic systems like Patriot, SMT. There is no third option.
Roman Lovich, you have always said that we need to turn our attention to occupied Crimea. And now the SBU has carried out a successful special operation, and then the bridges near Melitopol were blown up. These are very important logistical hubs that connect the occupied peninsula with the occupied south of Ukraine. It sustains the enemy's grouping. How do you assess the situation now? There were explosions last night, and explosions are continuing during the day in Crimea. We are attacking military targets. Please, the floor is yours.
In Crimea, they packed in like sardines in a can several million Russians from beyond the Urals who were promised something grand, so they increased the number of Russian cattle in Crimea. Naturally, they also crammed in military facilities there for almost 11 now, the 12th year. Before that, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was based there. We allowed them to do this well, mostly our so-called great leaders who looked so far ahead that in the end they lost Crimea in the first place, initially allowing its loss in 2014. So a large number of Russian civilian occupiers, they are indeed civilian occupiers, none of the rules apply to them, none at all, but they don't even know this. Any Russian who is on the occupied territory of Ukraine is considered an occupier, and none of the conventions that apply to civilians apply to them. That is, naturally, for us, they are the same occupiers as all the other so-called Russian military combatants who are in Crimea and are subject to elimination. In principle, eliminating them in Crimea is not that difficult. Why? Because Crimea itself is an enclosed space squeezed between 2 seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. In other words, it is practically a ready-made geographic operational cauldron with only 2 entry and exit points, from Taman via the Kerch Bridge and through the land corridors connecting it to mainland Ukraine. Mainly, if you look at the railway, it goes toward Melitopol through Henikes, meaning those are the branches leading there. That's why it's important for us, when liberating Ukraine, to start by liberating Crimea, because it's much easier to free Ukrainian territory if we liberate Crimea first. Moreover, it's even easier to liberate Crimea itself. If you compare the ratio of forces and resources needed with those required for liberating Donbas, you need an order of magnitude fewer forces and resources to liberate Crimea than to liberate Donbas. That's why, without a doubt, Crimea is simply begging to be the very first to break free from Russian captivity. There are actually many mechanisms for how this can be done. Well, first of all, of course, we need to cut off all the bridges that connect Crimea to the Russians. There are several of these bridges. Well, the first bridge is the Kerch Bridge. Moreover, there are several. There's a railway bridge, a road bridge, an energy bridge, a fuel bridge, and a water bridge. All of these are part of the Kerch system, the whole Kerch Bridge system, and it's absolutely necessary. All five of these bridges must be destroyed in this sense. The second bridge nearby, next to the Kerch Bridge, is the ferry crossing. The floating docks need to be destroyed. The floating docks, and of course, especially the railway ferries. The third bridge, generally speaking, is the so-called sea bridge. That is, these are the same LSTs, large landing ships, which can be used as ferries between ports, for example, on Russia's Black Sea coast and our Crimea. There are still several large landing ships left, and the Russians can use them to transport a significant amount of weaponry at serious tonnage. Then there's the air bridge. Well, the air bridge is a bit simpler. These are planes, these are airfields that can be targeted. And in principle, the air bridge can be cut off. And the main thing, of course, is the land bridge, the so-called land corridor, which the Russians are now trying to hold at a depth of 80 kilometers. By the way, it's very difficult to do this since it's pressed up against the Azov coast. And there are several branches running through there, both highways and railway lines. So, of course, those can be targeted as well, starting from Rostov, Taganrog, then through the Meuse, then across the Kalmius bridges. But realistically, for us, it's very close, about 80 to 100 kilometers to Melitopol and to the crossings, both types, meaning the northern crossings. And in principle, that's probably what we'll do. So these strikes that happen simultaneously, both on the Kerch Bridge and the bridge near Melitopol area, precisely on railway junctions. And that's exactly what this is about. First, cut off the supply systems and then hit them with long-range strike assets, which we have well. Everyone understands perfectly. If we manage to gather nearly 1,000 drones for Moscow, then we can definitely find 500 drones for Crimea once a week. The main thing now is to retarget specifically to this component. And the milestone regarding the liberation of Crimea is the third strike on the Kerch Bridge. You could say that the liberation of Crimea will begin with this strike. First, with long-range strike assets, they will dismantle Crimea molecule by molecule over the course of, well, half a year or even a year. Realistically, if you break it down by actions, first for several months up to a year, drones and missiles need to be used to strike military targets in Crimea. And only then, starting next spring, or maybe during the summer campaign of 2026, will our troops actually move into Crimea by land. But that's the optimal scenario. Of course, without air support, it's impossible to advance. That's why I think by next spring, we'll have enough Air Force units to support a ground operation. And for a year, we'll be relentlessly targeting Crimea.
All in all, the upcoming summer of 2025 in Crimea promises to be an exceptionally hot one indeed.
Absolutely. And the Russians really need to remember, we talked about this with you back in 2023. They need to learn how to swim because the Kerch Bridge will be gone. The exits from Crimea will definitely be under control. That's why Russians will have to paddle out of Crimea freestyle, breaststroke, or doggy paddle if they don't leave now by car or train, because those options simply won't exist.
Run, you racists, get out of Crimea. Friends, please like this video. Let us know in the comments what you think about our special operations, about the second and third phases of the SBU special operation. And Roman Grigorievich and I are continuing. So the SBU's web operation can be put on par with the elimination of Osama bin Laden, according to US Senator Richard Blumenthal. He called the operation itself proof of Ukraine's skill and determination. He says these strikes disprove the false narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and could shift momentum in Washington toward increasing aid to Ukraine. They can hit air bases 4,000 miles from Ukraine. They can strike anywhere. In terms of sheer skill and audacity, these attacks can be ranked alongside the US raid on Osama bin Laden and the Israeli pager operation as some of the greatest military achievements in recent years. Roman Grigorievich, please comment.
The Americans weren't shocked because we struck the Russians. The Americans tried this on for themselves, and now they're shocked to realize that their air bases are just as exposed as the Russian ones. They were protected from each other by treaties. That is, there were certain, I believe, under New START, certain protections specifically for strategic strike assets provided by these treaties. Moreover, one of the main conditions was that these planes had to be accessible for monitoring by external surveillance systems like satellites. So as a result, both the Russians and the Americans are required to park their planes in locations visible to the opposing side. But we're not adversaries. No one told Maliuk that he hasn't read the New START treaty. Naturally, he went ahead and struck the Russian strategic bombers, taking one issue off the table. And now the Americans are thinking, wait a minute, the same thing could happen at their bases too. And their bases are wide open. Nobody's even touched them. Honestly, if the Chinese or the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians set out to take out the American strategic bombers, there's nothing stopping them. And if the Chinese get serious about it, especially things could get real. We can see that in this regard, the Chinese are ahead of everyone else in the world. So for them, for the Americans, this is a real problem. They're not shocked by our so-called audacity. They're shocked by their own vulnerability to these kinds of strike capabilities, like Drone 7, a simple cheap drone.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich. Today I read a brilliant analysis by a woman on Facebook, a Ukrainian patriot. She wrote that the whole world, which is afraid of escalation, of nuclear escalation, which didn't give us long-range missiles, which didn't give us Taurus or other missiles that could have destroyed this entire nuclear triad, they're simply in shock, in fear that Ukraine managed to do all this without their help. Isn't that right, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, that's exactly how it is. Credit to the person who saw it this way, someone who is closely connected to military matters. That's exactly how it is. What was important in the last century, in the previous century, is now absolutely irrelevant, just as what was important in the century before last didn't matter to the last century, right? I mean, no one nowadays remembers the sling or, say, the boomerang, of course. I'm not talking about missiles. No one remembers bows, arrows, or spears anymore. Now, that is in the last century when rockets and airplanes appeared, and now we're already at the next stage. So what was needed in the last century is simply unnecessary now. Strategic bombers are no longer needed. No, for example, is the same Navy that used to consume trillions of dollars. I mean, just think how much had to be invested, trillions of dollars. And here, it turns out, Maliuk, by making the decision to destroy Russia's strategic aviation, simply crossed out this almost century-long saga of essentially the embezzlement of the world's largest military budgets. Trillions of dollars were invested in this, and now they're simply unnecessary. One of Ukraine's security services basically gave a big middle finger to this entire strategic triad, no matter what form it takes. Moreover, even the nuclear component of this strategic triad doesn't scare us for one simple reason. We have nuclear strike capabilities that are much more powerful, stronger, and more problematic for the enemy than theirs. A nuclear warhead that explodes, sometimes it's not even clear whether it was a nuclear explosion or just a powerful conventional missile. You can only tell with the radiometer. The glow from radionuclides that accompanies a nuclear explosion, if it is a nuclear explosion, fades quickly. And believe me, if you spend nuclear fuel rods on Moscow, we've talked about this so many times, Lenin would come back to life. Yes, he'd be more alive than anyone from the radiation that would fall, say, on Red Square. If the Russians use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, they understand this perfectly well. Why have they gone quiet on the nuclear topic now? Because they've realized that it wasn't for nothing that the hole was made in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And who knows what might end up falling on Grandpa Lenin. He might even grow a third head and start running around, telling the right story.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, let me ask you the following question. First of all, after these BU attacks on strategic nuclear aviation, Z channels reported the following information. That in Moscow, Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash, the commander of the Russian Air Force, accidentally fell out of a window. And now everyone is starting to count how many strategic bombers we have destroyed or eliminated. that is 41 have been damaged or destroyed. How significant are these losses? Please comment on this as a final point.
Well, if this isn't an IPSO, and it could be a Russian IPSO, they sometimes leak this kind of event into the information space through certain questionable channels. And then if the opposing side picks it up, for example, they present it as something negative, then they show this kobyliash, yes. And we'll go on to say that we are not quite the right kind of people in how we handle this. So for now, since there is no confirmation and there really isn't any, we are holding off. Although, strictly speaking, from the standpoint of responsibility, well, kobyliash should have been made to fly. But as for who, so to speak, will make him fly, or has made him, or will make him, that will depend on the Russian special service. Because if we're talking about real responsibility, it was specifically Kobyliash's responsibility to ensure the security of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. So if not now, then he'll have to fly later. Well, how else could it be?
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss the most pressing military topics and to celebrate the successes of our Ukrainian special services and the armed forces of Ukraine. We thank them. Our deepest respect, the well-known analyst Roman Svitan, Roman Grigorievich. Thank you very much. As always, see you again soon this week.
Goodbye.